Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Sunday. Welcome to the program. We have two great guests, Newt Gingrich and Mark Penn. But before we get to our guests, you know, folks, this Autopen issue is much bigger than people realize. You know, you have these people coming and going and pleading the Fifth Amendment or saying that Joe Biden, you know, he was the Einstein of our time and so forth, but you're basically getting stonewalled. We are, the American people. But this issue is so important, I decided to dig into it a little bit more, and people are missing one of the core constitutional problems with using the Autopen. And that is the requirement that the President of the United States be present. What are you talking about, Mark? A President of the United States can have a proxy sign a bill if he's present. He can have the Autopen sign the bill if he's present because of concerns of fraud. This issue of a presidential signature was a big deal at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Why? Because the President of the United States is the executive branch. So when Congress does all that work and they present a bill to the President, they want to make sure it's the President who's signing it, number one. And number two, it's the President who's authorizing it, number two. Again, this is a big deal. There were times, you know, when we had to actually fly a bill to a president who was overseas because there's requirements in the Constitution, a certain period of time that you have to sign a bill. And they would fly a jet overseas to get the president to sign it. That's how crucial this is. That's how important this is. There's a great piece in the Syracuse University College of Law by Terry Turnipseed in their review. And he says a couple things that are important. But first, I want to cite Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2. Isn't this great stuff? Stay with me. Every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it becomes law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approve, he shall sign it. But if not, he shall return it with its objections to the House in which it shall have originated. If after such reconsideration 2/3 of that House shall agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent together with the objections to the other House, by which it will likewise be recommended, and if approved by 2/3 of the House, it shall become a law. If any bill shall not be returned by the President within 10 days, Sundays excepted, after it shall have been presented to him, the same shall be a law in like manner as if he had signed it, unless the Congress, by their adjournment, prevent its return, in which case it shall not be law. So let's summarize. It thus establishes three means by which a bill can become law. Number one, by the signature of the President. Number two, by the supermajority of the Congress. Number three, by the lapse of 10 days, excluding Sundays, from presentment, assuming Congress is in session for the period, absent a veto and absent the signature of the President, okay? The signature requirement can be understood as a safeguard against the abuse of executive power. James Iredell, leader of the North Carolina Federalists and a future justice of the Supreme Court, explained, the President must be personally responsible for everything. And by the way, personally responsible is in italics and it's in the original. A necessary means of ensuring such accountability was that all important advice and decisions be reduced to writing. Iredell's discussion of the rule of the President's advisors is particularly illuminating in this respect. Quote, the President is not to be assisted by a council, summoned to a jovial dinner perhaps, and giving their opinions according to the nod of the President, but the opinion is to be given with the utmost solemnity, in writing. No after equivocation can explain it away. It must forever after speak for itself and commit the character of the writer in lasting colors either of fame or infamy or neutral significance to future ages as well as the present. He must sign. Note that the writing requirement has two attributes. First, it must be public, and second, the writing is imputed to the writer himself, the President. In this matter, Iredell explained, the President who acts should be responsible for his conduct, following advice at his peril, then that there should be a danger of punishing any man for an erroneous opinion which might possibly be sincere. So, if presidential approval alone were enough, I approve it, the President says, this bill from Congress and so forth, to turn a bill into law, it would be sufficient for the president to inform Congress of his consent for the record. The president's signature alone authoritatively communicates his approbation. Thus, it is only by signing a bill that the president can turn it into law. The use of the Autopen to sign a bill outside the presence of the president or the use of a proxy outside the presence of the president is unconstitutional. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take a delegate to the Constitutional Convention's word for it. How about this? When a question has come up to the Office of Legal Counsel, the Constitutional and Legal Brain Trust in the Department of Justice, we not only have 1, 2, 3, 4 opinions to that effect, we have more. We have a Rehnquist letter. We have a Scalia memorandum. We have another memorandum by the Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Office of Legal Counsel. We have a memorandum by an Attorney General. We have another Rehnquist memorandum. And we have a memorandum on top of that. Saying what? Multiple prior legal opinions indicating the president could not use a non-presence proxy to sign legislation. That is, whether it's an Autopen or an individual, he must be present to sign legislation if he's not going to sign it himself. This is something that hasn't been discussed anywhere. Now, I don't expect most of the media to discuss it except here because they don't give a damn. But this is a crucial constitutional issue. It always has been. And it was a major issue at the Constitutional Convention. Who signs? What kind of signature? The presence requirement to prevent fraud. This goes back to the statute of frauds. I'm doing this off the top of my head, which I think is from the 1600s. When you sign a contract, typically you have to notarize it and so forth. They want to make sure there's no fraud. Well, same with the president, who is the executive branch. Only he has the power to sign a bill. Or he must be present if there's going to be an Autopen, which obviously didn't have at the founding, but it requires his presentment. Or if he has a proxy. But it even gets worse. Why are we here? I mean, this issue came up here and there in the past. That's why we have all these opinions from the Office of Legal Counsel, the Department of Justice. It came up under Obama, and of course he violated it. But they come up here and there. It's very rare. But with Joe Biden, it defines his presidency. What did he sign and what didn't he sign? Why? Because Joe Biden wasn't with it. Joe Biden wasn't cognitively with it. And so that's why this is a scandal on top of scandals. And of course, that's why the Democrat Party and their media are trying to ignore it desperately. But understand, if legislation was signed by an Autopen and Joe Biden wasn't present, that's unconstitutional. That's null and void. And there's even more than that. So we've talked about the 25th Amendment. I want to talk about it again. Because guess what? We have members of Biden's cabinet who want to run for president, like Buttigieg. Perhaps his former vice president who ran for president and failed. Maybe she wants to run too, Harris. But they violated their oaths of office. And this needs to be pinned on their shirts if they choose to run again. Because what they did was outrageous. The 25th Amendment, Section 1. In case of the removal of the president from office or his death or his resignation, the vice president shall become president. See, we didn't have any formal succession in the Constitution. This kind of provides at least some when it comes to the president and vice president. I won't bother you with Section 2 because it's not relevant. Section 3, whenever the president transmits to the president pro tem of the Senate, president of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, his written declaration, say Biden did, that he's unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president. Now, this has happened. Like when Ronald Reagan had surgery, or some of the others have had surgery, they sign this, they present it to the Senate and the House, President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, that they've temporarily conferred power on the vice president who becomes acting president, not president, acting president. But Section 4 is where I want to go. Whenever the vice president and majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other bodies Congress may by law provide the cabinet secretaries, transmit to the President of the Senate, the President pro tem of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The Vice President shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting Vice President. Vice President and a majority of the cabinet gets together and says, Joe is not cutting it. We've been in enough meetings with him. We have an obligation. We swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States. We have an obligation to inform the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House. There it is in the 25th Amendment. He's not cognitively able to do his job. Thereafter, when the President transmits to the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House his written declaration that no inability exists, so Biden says, wait a minute, listens to his wife, the good doctor. She says, Joe, this is a coup. You need to write a letter under the 25th Amendment to the President of the Senate, to the Speaker of the House, and you need to tell them, my Vice President's wrong, the majority of the Cabinet's wrong. I reject what they're saying. He shall resume the powers and duties of his office unless the Vice President and majority of either the principal officers of the Executive Department or of such other bodies Congress may by law provide transmit within 4 days to the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. So Biden, he says, now I am able to do this. Okay, so the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet again have the right within 4 days to write the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, well, he's wrong. We're right. And under those circumstances, the Vice President remains the acting President. Thereupon, Congress shall decide, while this is going on, shall decide the issue, assembling within 48 hours for that purpose, if not in session. If the Congress, within 21 days after receipt of the latter written declaration, again, that last letter, or if Congress is not in session, within 21 days after Congress is required to assemble, determines by 2/3 vote of both houses that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall continue to discharge the same as acting President. Otherwise, the President shall resume the powers and duties of his office. So Congress will decide who's right. 2/3 vote of both bodies. Either uphold it, that is the letter that keeps the Vice President as the acting President and thereby removes the President of the United States, or it keeps the President as President and no longer is the Vice President acting Vice President. Well, there we are in the weeds, but that's your Constitution. So what happened here? Nothing. Nothing happened here. Nothing. Not a single cabinet member raised an objection. The Vice President never raised an objection, as I said at the time. They've turned the 25th Amendment into a dead amendment. Into a dead amendment. Yes, as it applies to surgeries and temporary situations, or perhaps an assassination or something like that. But when it comes to true disability and inability to do your job, where you're using the Autopen as an example, or where the American people can see it, where world leaders can see it, where members of the Congress can see it, the media can see it, even though they conceal it. They destroyed the 25th Amendment for very crucial purposes. The main author of the 25th Amendment was a Democrat senator by the name of Birch Bayh out of Indiana. This term inability, he said, the word inability and the word unable, as used in Section 4, refer to an impairment of the President's faculties, mean that he's unable to either make or communicate the decisions as to his own competency to execute the powers and duties of his office. He said, we are questioning the disability of the President, the man who has his finger on the button. The issue needs to be decided immediately. Wow. Let's dig in further. The Fordham Law Review by John D. Feerick. There's a discussion between Birch Bayh, senator from Indiana, and the senator from New York, Robert Kennedy. Is it not true that the inability to which we're referring in the proposed amendment is total inability to exercise the powers and duties of the office? Asked Robert Kennedy. Birch Bayh says the inability that we deal with here is described several times in the amendment. The amendment itself has the inability of the President to perform the powers and duties of his office. It is conceivable that a president might be able to walk, for example, and thus, by the definition of some people, might be physically able. But at the same time, he might not possess the mental capacity to make a decision and perform the powers and duties of his office. We're talking about inability to perform the constitutional duties of the office of the President. Mr. Kennedy, And that has to be total disability to perform the powers and duties of the office? Mr. Bai, Senator is correct. We are not getting into a position through the pending measure in which when a president makes an unpopular decision, he would immediately be rendered unable to perform the duties of his office. Mr. Kennedy, is it limited to the mental inability to make or communicate his decision regarding his capacity and mental inability to perform the powers and duties prescribed by law? Mr. Bai, I do not believe that we should limit it to mental disability. It is conceivable that the president might fall into the hands of the enemy, for example. Mr. Kennedy, it involves physical or mental inability to make or communicate his decision regarding his capacity and physical or mental inability to exercise the powers and duties of his office. Mr. Bai, the senator is correct. That is very important. I would refer the senator back to the definition which I read into the record at the time the Senate passed this measure earlier in the year. Mr. Kennedy, it was that definition that I was seeking to reemphasize. May I ask one other question? Is it not true that the inability referred to must be expected to be of a long duration, or at least one whose duration is uncertain and might persist? Mr. Bai, here again, I think one of the advantages of this particular amendment is the leeway it gives us. We are not talking about the kind of inability in which the president went to the dentist and was under anesthesia. It is not that type of inability we are talking about. But the cabinet, as well as the vice president and Congress, are going to have to judge the severity of the disability and the problems that face our country. Mr. Kennedy, is it not true that what we are talking about here, as far as inability is concerned, is not a brief or temporary inability? Mr. Bai, we're talking about one that would seriously impair the president's ability to perform the powers and duties of his office. Mr. Kennedy, could a president have such inability for a short period of time? Mr. Bai, a president who was unconscious for 30 minutes when missiles were flying toward this country might only be disabled temporarily, but it would be of severe consequence when viewed in the light of the problems facing the country. So at that time, even for that short duration, someone would have to make a decision. But a disability which has persisted for only a short time would ordinarily be excluded. If a president were unable to make an executive decision which might have severe consequences for the country, I would think we would be better off under the conditions of the amendment. Mr. Kennedy, the senator realizes the complications for the people of this country and the world under those circumstances. Mr. Bai, I do indeed. I also recognize our difficulty if we had no amendment at all. Now that's fascinating to me. And it was as if we had no amendment at all when Joe Biden was president of the United States. And the cabinet and the vice president, they either collaborated or they conspired, affirmatively or by silence, to allow Joe Biden to be president of the United States when he was incapacitated. Being president of the United States is an extraordinarily difficult, complex, wearing, stressful, pressure-packed job. Even the healthiest men, young men, they age very quickly under the pressures of the office. It's the most important office in the world. If somebody had Joe Biden's mental capacity, you wouldn't make him CEO of any company, not even a small business. He shouldn't be driving a car. And I say this not to mock, I say this as a fact. This amendment was intended to protect us. The Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, and every cabinet member chose not to comply with their oath of office and to leave the nation naked to somebody who had this incapacity. This is why we have the issue with the Autopen. This is why that investigation is crucial as well, because I suspect a lot of things were signed officially where Joe Biden wasn't present, where Joe Biden didn't authorize it. In either case, he would have to be present.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.